"Your tire's gone flat," the single father said over the roar of rain. The woman in the driver's seat barely glanced at him, fingers tight on a phone that had already lost signal. Water streamed down the windshield of the luxury sedan, and the storm swallowed the empty corporate road around them. "I don't need roadside charity," she muttered. "Security's on the way." But 10 minutes later, the mechanic was already kneeling in the rain, loosening the bolts with steady hands while thunder rolled over the biotech towers nearby. She watched in silence as he worked like the storm didn't exist. By morning, black SUVs would surround his tiny garage, because sometimes the stranger who fixes your tire in the rain is the only person who can save what power and money cannot. Before you see the exact moment when corporate security realizes the soaked mechanic knows more about sabotage than their entire engineering team. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. This isn't really a story about a tire in the rain. It's about the kind of strength the world forgets to notice. Rain kept hammering the pavement long after the tire was changed. The mechanic stood, wiped his hands on a rag pulled from his jacket pocket, and tightened the last bolt with a small practiced twist. The woman finally stepped out of the car, heels sinking slightly into the soaked gravel. "You didn't have to do that," she said, studying him more carefully now. He shrugged. "Flat tire in weather like this can get dangerous." That was all he said. No request for money, no business card. Just a quiet nod before rolling his worn toolbox closed. His name was Ethan Calder, though the world around that empty road had no reason to know it yet. Ethan lifted the damaged tire into the trunk with easy strength. Rain dripped from the brim of his cap, while the wind pushed cold water down the collar of his jacket. "You should drive slow until you reach the main highway," he added calmly. The woman's expression remained guarded, the way powerful people often looked at strangers who appeared too comfortable near their world. The glowing towers of Arkwright Biotechnologies rose above the trees behind her car, their glass walls reflecting lightning across the sky. Most people who worked there wore pressed suits and security badges. Ethan wore grease on his hands and work boots that had seen 1,000 roadside calls. Yet something about the way he glanced toward the facility suggested recognition rather than awe. The storm deepened. Thunder rolled low across the valley, vibrating through the empty service road. "You work nearby?" she asked suddenly. Not exactly. He closed the trunk and stepped back from the car. For a moment the headlights illuminated his face clearly. Calm eyes. Tired maybe, but focused. "Then why were you out here in the middle of nowhere?" she pressed. Ethan gestured toward the distant highway beyond the trees. "Garage down the road. Someone called about engine trouble earlier tonight. Guess I took the long way back. It wasn't entirely a lie." The woman nodded slowly, though it was clear she was still trying to place something about him. Power had a way of making people suspicious when someone didn't seem impressed by it. Wind pushed rain sideways across the road again. He stepped away from the vehicle and lifted his toolbox into the back of his battered pickup truck parked behind the sedan. The truck looked almost invisible beside the polished luxury car. "Should be good now," he said. She hesitated. "Wait." He paused but didn't turn around right away. "I never asked your name." He finally glanced back. "Ethan?" "Just Ethan?" He smiled faintly. "Usually works fine." For a second she seemed like she might ask more questions, but a distant rumble of approaching vehicles echoed through the rain. Security lights appeared far down the access road, dark SUVs cutting through the storm. He followed the sound with his eyes. "Looks like your security team made it after all." The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly as the vehicles drew closer. She clearly belonged to the world behind those guarded gates. Still, before getting back into her car, she looked at him again. curiosity flickering across her expression. "You're very calm for someone standing in a lightning storm fixing a stranger's car." He leaned against the side of his truck and pulled his cap lower. Storms come and go. Another flash of lightning lit the towers again. For a split second, his gaze drifted toward the facility. Not admiration. Assessment. Then he climbed into the truck. The engine started with a rough growl, while the SUVs approached through the rain headlights slicing across the empty road. The battered pickup rolled slowly forward while the black SUVs swept past it in the rain. Their headlights carved white tunnels through the storm as they raced toward the stranded luxury car behind him. Ethan didn't slow down to watch what happened next. He had already done what he came to do. Storms, broken engines, flat tires, those were the kinds of problems he dealt with. Corporate security arriving with flashing lights belonged to another world entirely. His truck rattled down the narrow road until the towers of Arkwright Biotechnologies disappeared behind the trees. By the time he reached the highway, the rain had begun to soften. Ethan drove the rest of the way home in silence, windshield wipers tapping rhythmically while the sky slowly lightened toward morning. The small house at the edge of town came into view just as the clouds began to thin. A single porch light glowed in the gray dawn. Inside, the world was much quieter. Leela Calder was already awake. 9 years old and sitting cross-legged at the kitchen table, she looked up the moment the door opened. "You were out all night again," she said, trying to sound stern even though her voice still carried sleep. Ethan hung his soaked jacket by the door. "Storm emergency." "That's what you said last time." He smiled faintly. "Well, storms keep happening." She studied him carefully while he poured himself coffee. Lila had a way of noticing things most kids didn't. "You're soaked." Occupational hazard, she pushed a plate toward him. "I saved you some toast." Ethan took a bite and leaned against the counter, letting the warmth of the kitchen slowly replace the cold from the rain. Moments like this were why he had chosen the quiet life. No alarms, no briefings, no impossible decisions hanging over hundreds of lives. Just a small garage down the road and a daughter who expected him home for breakfast. Outside, the storm clouds continued drifting east. Morning sunlight finally reached the street. By 8 o'clock, Ethan had already opened the garage. Calder Auto Repair sat on a modest corner between a gas station and a closed diner that never seemed to reopen on time. The building was old but solid, its red paint faded from years of weather. He rolled up the large metal door and let the fresh morning air fill the space. The smell of oil and rubber greeted him like an old friend. Ethan moved through the shop with quiet efficiency. Tool racks checked, air compressor running, workbench cleared, a routine built from years of repetition. The town slowly came alive around him. Delivery trucks passed, neighbors waved. Someone down the street argued loudly with a barking dog. Normal life. Ethan had just lifted the hood of a customer's sedan when the low rumble of engines drifted down the road. At first he barely noticed it. Then the sound grew louder. He looked up. 3 black SUVs turned onto the street. They moved slowly, deliberately. The kind of vehicles that didn't belong in neighborhoods like this. Engines deep and powerful. Windows tinted dark. People on the sidewalk paused. The SUVs rolled forward until they stopped directly in front of the garage. The entire street seemed to go quiet. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. "Well," he murmured. The doors opened almost in unison. 4 men stepped out first, all wearing dark suits despite the heat rising from the pavement. Professional. Alert. The posture of trained security. Then the rear passenger door of the lead SUV opened, and the woman from the storm stepped out. Her appearance was very different in daylight. The rain-soaked driver from the night before now stood composed and authoritative, wearing a tailored coat and carrying the kind of quiet confidence that filled boardrooms. People on the sidewalk whispered. Even if they didn't recognize her face, power had a way of announcing itself. She walked toward the garage. The security team followed closely behind. Ethan leaned casually against the open hood of the car he'd been inspecting. "Well," he said calmly. "Tire holding up?" The woman stopped a few feet away. For a moment, she simply looked around the shop. The worn tools, the concrete floor, the faded posters on the wall. Then her eyes returned to him. "Yes," she said, "it is." Her voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it now. Urgency. "My name is Dr. Vivian Arkwright." The name hung in the air like a dropped wrench. Even people across the street seemed to recognize it. Founder and CEO of Arkwright Biotechnologies, one of the most powerful corporate leaders in the region. Ethan nodded once. Morning. The security team exchanged puzzled looks. This was not the reaction they were used to seeing. Vivian studied him carefully. "You helped me last night during the storm. Looked like you needed help." "Yes," she took a slow breath. "Which is why I need your help again." That finally caught his attention. Ethan straightened slightly. "Car trouble already?" "Not exactly." Her expression hardened. "There was an incident at my facility during the storm." He waited. Something in the silence shifted. "Our containment systems began failing shortly after you left," she continued. The security men behind her shifted uncomfortably. "Engineers are still trying to stabilize everything." Ethan folded the rag slowly. "And?" Vivian's eyes locked onto his. "And the way you looked at the facility last night tells me you understood something." The mechanic didn't answer right away. He simply watched the street for a moment, the quiet town, the garage, his normal life. Then he looked back at her. "What exactly happened at your facility?" Before she could answer, one of the security officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, with respect, he's a mechanic." Vivian didn't even glance back at him. "Yes," she said calmly. Then her gaze returned to Ethan. "That's what everyone keeps telling me." If this story is pulling you in so far, subscribe and turn on the bell. Because the moment they bring this mechanic inside that facility, everything changes. The words hung in the air between them. "That's what everyone keeps telling me." For a moment, no one moved. The quiet street watched from a distance, neighbors pretending to sweep sidewalks or check their phones, while their eyes stayed locked on the strange scene unfolding at Calder Auto Repair. Ethan finally set the rag down on the workbench. "Well," he said evenly, "everyone's usually right about that." One of the security officers shifted impatiently. "Ma'am, this is wasting time. Engineering teams are already handling the situation." Vivian Arkwright ignored him. Her attention never left the mechanic. "You noticed something last night," she said. Ethan leaned against the open hood again, crossing his arms casually. "Noticed a storm? That's not what I meant." The tone of her voice sharpened slightly. "You were looking at the facility. Not the lightning. The towers. The ventilation stacks." Ethan's eyes flickered briefly toward the distant skyline beyond the town. From this street, the glass structures of Arkwright Biotechnologies barely peeked above the tree line. Most people would see nothing but another corporate complex. "Big building," he said quietly. "That facility contains several restricted containment labs," Vivian replied. "Last night our monitoring systems began failing in a very specific sequence." The security chief stepped forward now. Tall. Broad shoulders, cold expression. "Marcus Vance," he said, introducing himself without warmth. "Head of corporate security." His eyes scanned Ethan like a problem that needed solving. "We've already brought in external consultants. We don't need roadside mechanics speculating about internal infrastructure. Ethan shrugged. Works for me. He reached for a wrench and turned back toward the car he'd been repairing. The dismissal clearly surprised Marcus. "Ma'am," Marcus said firmly to Vivienne, "we should return to the facility." But she still hadn't moved. Instead, she watched the mechanic closely. "You didn't answer my question," she said. Ethan tightened a bolt under the hood, the metal clicking softly. "What question?" "What you saw." The garage fell silent except for the faint ticking of the cooling engine. Finally, he stepped back from the car and wiped his hands again. "You ever see lightning hit a transformer?" he asked casually. Marcus frowned. "What does that have to do with?" "It creates a chain reaction," Ethan continued calmly. "One failure leads to another." Vivienne's eyes sharpened. "That's exactly what happened." Marcus crossed his arms. "Power surge. Our systems are designed for that." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Yeah?" Marcus gave a thin smile. "Redundant power systems. Emergency overrides. Internal stabilization protocols. Sounds expensive, they are." Ethan studied Vivienne for a long second. "Yet you're standing in my garage." That landed. Marcus looked irritated. "Our engineers are managing the situation." Vivienne finally spoke again. Not successfully. The admission made the security chief stiffen. "Containment alarms triggered at 3 different levels," she continued. "Ventilation overrides locked. System diagnostics aren't responding." Ethan's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes changed. He walked slowly toward the garage entrance and looked down the road toward the distant facility. "Storm knocked something loose?" he asked. "That's the official explanation," Marcus said quickly. "But?" Ethan asked. Vivienne answered. "But the sequence doesn't make sense." Another quiet pause. Wind rustled the loose metal sign hanging outside the garage. Ethan looked back at her. "You ever see sabotage before?" he asked. Marcus laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "This is a biotech research facility, not a military base." Ethan didn't react. He simply glanced down at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up again. "Maybe." Marcus shook his head. Enough of this. He turned toward Vivienne. "We're leaving." But she still hadn't moved. "You recognized the pattern," she said softly. It wasn't a question anymore. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Across the street, someone quietly lifted their phone to record. Finally, he exhaled. "Storm didn't cause your problem," Marcus scoffed. "And you know that how?" Ethan pointed casually toward the skyline again. "Lightning hit the south ventilation tower around midnight." Vivienne's eyes widened slightly. "How do you know that?" "Because the flash reflected off the west glass panels 2 seconds later." Marcus frowned. "That doesn't prove anything." Ethan's gaze returned to Vivienne. "Systems probably failed in layers after that, right?" She didn't answer immediately. Her silence was answer enough. The security chief looked uneasy now. "You're guessing, maybe," Ethan said. Vivienne stepped closer. "If you're not guessing, then what are you saying?" He hesitated. Just for a second, then the mechanic picked up the rag again and folded it neatly. "I'm saying storms don't usually break systems that well protected." Marcus's patience snapped. "That's enough." But Vivienne raised a hand to stop him. Her voice dropped slightly. "What breaks them like that?" Ethan met her eyes. "Someone who knows exactly how they're built." The word settled into the garage like a sudden drop in temperature. Marcus Vance stared at the mechanic as if he'd just heard something ridiculous. "That's speculation," the security chief said flatly. Ethan didn't argue. He simply folded the rag again and placed it on the edge of the workbench, his movements slow and deliberate. Vivienne Arkwright, however, did not look amused. "You said the failures would happen in layers," she said carefully. That's usually how it works. Marcus scoffed. You're talking like you've seen this before. Ethan gave a small shrug. Broken systems are broken systems. Marcus stepped closer, his tone sharper now. You're a mechanic. Correct. So stop pretending you understand high-security containment infrastructure. Ethan didn't rise to the challenge. Instead, he glanced past them, toward the SUVs idling outside the garage. Their engines hummed quietly, powerful machines waiting for orders. The mechanic wiped his hands once more. What exactly failed first? He asked. Marcus immediately responded. We're not discussing internal corporate information with civilians. But Vivienne answered. South ventilation control. Marcus turned toward her. Ma'am. Then secondary pressure regulation, she continued. Ethan's expression didn't change, but he slowly nodded. And after that, Vivienne's voice grew quieter. 2 containment locks triggered. The garage suddenly felt smaller. Marcus folded his arms again. Coincidence. Electrical cascade. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Electrical cascades don't target containment locks, Marcus laughed once. Now you're just guessing. Ethan looked toward the street where a few neighbors had stopped pretending not to watch. Then he looked back at Vivienne. You got engineers inside running diagnostics, right? Yes, and they can't override the system? Her silence again answered the question. Marcus's jaw tightened. That's because the lockdown protocol prevents unauthorized access during containment risk. Ethan nodded slowly. Exactly. Marcus glared at him. You're repeating things you don't understand. But Vivienne was staring at the mechanic with growing intensity. You knew that would happen, she said quietly. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned slightly against the side of the sedan in the garage. You said alarms triggered in layers, Ethan said, which means whoever set it up wanted your people chasing the wrong problem first. Marcus stepped forward again. Enough. But Vivienne raised a hand. What problem? She asked. Ethan glanced toward the distant biotech complex again. Power. Marcus crossed his arms. Our power grid is isolated. Exactly, Ethan replied. The security chief frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Ethan met his eyes. It means whoever designed the failure knew your engineers would assume a power cascade. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but paused. Vivienne spoke instead. And you're saying it isn't? Not likely. Then what is it? Ethan exhaled slowly. System diversion. Marcus shook his head. That's nonsense. Ethan's voice remained calm. Containment systems are built with layers for a reason. Vivienne nodded slowly. Safety redundancy. Right, Ethan said. So if someone wanted to get inside something important, Marcus interrupted. They'd trigger the safety layers. Ethan looked at him. Exactly. For the first time since arriving, the security chief hesitated. The garage fell quiet again. Vivienne's voice came next. You're saying someone wanted our engineers distracted. Maybe? Distracted from what? Ethan studied her for a moment. That's the part your engineers should be figuring out. Marcus shook his head again. This is pointless. He turned toward the SUVs. Ma'am, we're leaving. Vivienne didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer to Ethan. You noticed all of this from a roadside during a thunderstorm? He shrugged. Storm was loud. Hard not to notice things. Marcus's patience snapped again. You're entertaining this because of a coincidence last night. But Vivienne shook her head slightly. No. She looked around the garage again. At the worn tools. The oil stains on the concrete floor. The small, handwritten schedule pinned to the wall. Then she returned her gaze to the mechanic. You didn't look surprised when I mentioned containment alarms. Ethan didn't respond. You looked certain. Marcus laughed under his breath. This man fixes transmissions. Vivienne ignored him completely. "What did you do before this?" she asked Ethan. The question hung in the air. Ethan glanced briefly toward the street again. Then he looked back at her. "Different kind of repair work." Marcus rolled his eyes. "Oh, please." But Vivienne didn't laugh. Her voice remained calm. "What kind?" Ethan hesitated, not because he was unsure, because answering would change things. He finally said quietly, "The kind where systems failing can get people hurt." Marcus immediately dismissed it. Everyone says things like that, but Vivienne's eyes narrowed slightly. "You said earlier someone would need to know exactly how the system was built." "Yeah." She took a small step closer. "Do you?" Ethan didn't answer. The wind rattled the garage door slightly as a passing truck moved down the road. Then one of the security officer's radios crackled. Marcus turned instinctively. "Go ahead." A voice burst through the static. "Sir, engineering just triggered a full facility lockdown." Vivienne's head snapped toward the radio. "What?" The officer spoke quickly. "Containment pressure rising in Lab Sector 3. Marcus's expression changed immediately. "That's impossible." Diagnostics were running. The radio crackled again. "Sir, they're saying the override systems aren't responding." Silence swallowed the garage. Every eye slowly turned back toward Ethan. He closed the toolbox with a soft metallic click. Then the mechanic said quietly, "Yeah. That's about the time the real problem usually starts." The word settled heavily in the garage. For a moment no one moved. Marcus Vance stared at Ethan as if he'd just heard the most inconvenient sentence possible. Then the radio crackled again. "Sir, containment pressure is still rising. Engineering says Sector 3 seals aren't responding." Marcus grabbed the radio. "That's not possible. Override the lock." "We tried." "The system isn't accepting commands." Vivienne Arkwright stepped forward. Put it on speaker. The officer obeyed instantly. The voice from the facility sounded tense now. "Ma'am, we're seeing command rejection across multiple consoles. It's like the system is blocking us out." Marcus looked furious. "Manual override attempted, sir. The doors sealed automatically." Vivienne's voice dropped. "How long before containment thresholds are exceeded?" A pause. 30 minutes, maybe less. The garage fell silent again. Across the street, the onlookers had stopped pretending not to watch. Even they could feel something serious unfolding. Marcus turned toward Vivienne immediately. "We need to move. Our engineers will resolve this." Then he shot Ethan an irritated look. "This conversation is over." But Vivienne didn't move toward the SUVs. Her attention remained fixed on the mechanic. Ethan had already returned to the workbench. He calmly tightened the latch on his toolbox. Marcus scoffed. "You're not seriously considering bringing him along?" Vivienne answered without looking away from Ethan. "He predicted the containment sequence. He guessed." Ethan spoke quietly without turning around. "Sector 3 handles pressure stabilization for the lower labs." Marcus froze. Ethan continued calmly. "Which means if that seal fails, the system starts compensating in the ventilation network." The security chief narrowed his eyes. "How would you know that?" Ethan finally turned. "Because that's how containment redundancy works." Marcus shook his head. "You're repeating basic engineering principles," Ethan shrugged. "Then your engineer should already have it under control." The radio crackled again. "Sir, we're now seeing ventilation instability across 2 adjacent sectors." Marcus swore under his breath. Vivienne's eyes moved slowly back to Ethan. "You said someone set this up. Looks that way. Then what's the next step?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the open garage door and looked down the quiet street. Morning sunlight had finally broken through the clouds. Birds chirped. The town carried on with normal life, a strange contrast to the rising tension in the small shop. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "Systems like yours are designed to fail safe," he said calmly. Marcus crossed his arms. "Correct. Which means whoever triggered this isn't trying to destroy the facility." Vivienne leaned forward slightly. "Then what are they trying to do?" Ethan looked back at her. "Force someone inside." Marcus shook his head again. "That makes no sense." Ethan pointed casually toward the radio. "You said engineers can't access the overrides because the lockdown protocol prevents it." "Right," Marcus frowned. "So?" Ethan met his eyes. "Which means someone with higher clearance probably has to go down there manually." Silence. Vivienne's expression changed. "You're saying someone is baiting us?" Ethan nodded once. "Looks that way." Marcus immediately dismissed the idea. Ridiculous. But the radio interrupted again. "Sir, containment pressure just past the safety buffer." Marcus turned sharply. "How long now?" 20 minutes, Vivienne inhaled slowly. "Prepare the transport," she ordered. Marcus nodded and turned toward the SUVs. "Let's go." But before she followed him, Vivienne paused beside Ethan. "You seem very certain about all of this." Ethan gave a small smile. "Experience?" She studied him. "What kind?" Ethan looked down at his hands. Grease stains. Old scars across the knuckles. Then he looked back up. "The kind where broken systems get people hurt." Marcus called from outside. "Ma'am." Vivienne turned toward the SUVs. But before leaving, she spoke again. "Come with us." Ethan blinked once. "I run a garage, and my facility is running out of time." Marcus stepped back inside immediately. "Absolutely not." Vivienne didn't look at him. "This man predicted every development so far," Marcus glared. "That doesn't make him qualified." Ethan lifted his toolbox. "Relax." Both of them looked at him. "I'm not coming." Vivienne frowned. "Why not?" Ethan set the toolbox down again. "Because if I'm right," he gestured toward the distant facility beyond the trees. "Whoever set this up knows exactly how that place works." Marcus snapped. "Our engineers built it." Ethan's eyes held steady. "Yeah." Then he added quietly, "And people who build systems usually know how to break them." The radio crackled again. This time the voice sounded urgent. "Sir, we just lost 2 additional containment monitors." Marcus swore again. Vivienne looked back at Ethan. The mechanic had already started closing the garage door. "You're still not coming?" she asked. Ethan paused halfway through, pulling the door down. Then he glanced toward the street where the black SUVs waited, and toward the distant glass towers rising over the trees. Finally, he sighed. "If I come," he said slowly, "things might get complicated." Vivienne answered immediately. "They already are." Ethan stared at the ground for a second. Then he grabbed his toolbox again. "All right." Marcus groaned in frustration. "This is insane." Ethan walked past him toward the SUVs. As he climbed into the vehicle beside the security team, he muttered quietly, "By the way, if you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell, because what happens when this mechanic walks into that facility is where things really start getting dangerous." The convoy of black SUVs pulled away from the quiet street, and Ethan's normal life disappeared behind them. The black SUVs tore down the highway toward the biotech campus, engines growling as the convoy pushed far past the town limits. Inside the lead vehicle, silence sat heavy between the passengers. Ethan rested his toolbox on his knees, watching the landscape pass through the tinted glass. Marcus Vance sat across from him, arms folded tightly. The security chief hadn't stopped studying him since they left the garage. "You're awfully calm," Marcus finally said. Ethan shrugged. "Panicking usually doesn't fix machines." "This isn't a machine," Marcus replied sharply. "This is a high-security research facility. Everything's a machine," Ethan said quietly. Just depends how complicated it is. Vivienne Arkwright sat beside the window, her attention fixed on the distant towers now rising larger against the skyline. From this distance, the campus looked like a city of glass and steel, multiple towers connected by sky bridges, satellite labs, cooling stacks, security checkpoints, a place built to handle problems. Yet right now that place was failing. Her phone buzzed again. She answered instantly. Report. The voice on the other end sounded strained. Ma'am, Sector 3 pressure just crossed containment threshold 2. Vivienne closed her eyes briefly. How long before breach risk? 15 minutes. Marcus leaned forward immediately. Deploy internal response teams. They're already moving, sir, but the system still isn't accepting override commands. Vivienne glanced at Ethan. You predicted the cascade. Ethan's eyes remained on the facility growing closer through the windshield. Not hard to predict once you know how containment networks are layered. Marcus shook his head again. You keep saying that. He leaned forward. So explain something. Ethan turned his gaze toward him. If someone sabotaged the system like you claim, how did they get past security? Ethan gave a small smile. The same way anyone gets past security. Marcus frowned. Which is? Knowing where the blind spots are, Marcus didn't respond to that. The convoy turned sharply through the outer checkpoint of Arkwright Biotechnologies. Massive steel gates slid open as armed security waved them through. Ethan watched the facility carefully now. The closer they came, the more details appeared. Emergency lights flashing on several towers, engineers rushing between buildings, containment alarms pulsing faintly through the complex. Marcus noticed where Ethan's attention kept going. You're analyzing the layout. Ethan didn't deny it. Old habit, Vivienne spoke quietly. You've seen systems like this before. He considered the question. Similar ones. Where? Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he leaned slightly forward. That tower, he said, pointing through the windshield. Marcus looked. What about it? Ventilation routing hub, Marcus frowned. How would you know that? Placement. Ethan gestured again. You keep ventilation towers away from central labs but still close enough for pressure regulation. Vivienne studied him carefully. You're not guessing. Ethan didn't respond. The SUVs rolled to a stop in front of the main operations building. Security teams rushed toward the vehicles the moment the doors opened. Marcus stepped out first. Clear the entry route, he ordered. Engineers stood near the doors, clearly rattled. One of them approached Vivienne quickly. Ma'am, pressure in Sector 3 continues climbing. Internal teams can't access the override controls. Vivienne nodded. Show us. The group moved quickly through the glass entry doors. Inside, the facility felt very different from the quiet street Ethan had left behind. Alarm lights flashed across the ceilings. Large screens in the central operations room displayed pressure readings and system diagnostics. Multiple engineers argued over consoles. Override still blocked, containment seals responding too slowly, ventilation routing unstable. Marcus stepped into the middle of the chaos. Status. A senior engineer approached immediately. Sir, Sector 3 pressure continues rising. We've tried every digital override, but the system keeps rejecting commands. Marcus gestured toward Ethan dismissively. Explain the situation to him. The engineer blinked. Who? Just do it. Ethan stepped closer to the main console. He studied the screen quietly. Numbers scrolled rapidly. Pressure levels. Ventilation routing. Containment integrity. He leaned slightly closer. Then he said something that made the engineer freeze. Someone inserted a command loop. Marcus frowned. That's impossible. Ethan pointed at the monitor. See that repeating code? The engineer leaned closer. Wait. He typed rapidly. Then his expression changed. "He's right." Marcus stared. "What?" The engineer turned, the system's running the same authorization check over and over. Vivienne stepped closer. "Meaning?" Ethan answered calmly. "It's locked in a verification loop." Marcus crossed his arms again. "Fix it." The engineer shook his head. "That's the problem. The loop blocks any remote override." Vivienne looked between them. "So how do we stop it?" Ethan finally stepped away from the console. "There's only one way." Marcus frowned. "Well?" The mechanic picked up his toolbox. "You shut it down manually." Silence filled the room. The engineer's face went pale. "You mean inside the containment vault?" Ethan nodded once. Marcus immediately shook his head. "That's restricted access." Ethan looked at him. "Yeah." Then he glanced at the screen again, where the pressure numbers kept rising. "You might want to decide quickly." The pressure numbers on the central monitor continued climbing, each red digit blinking with quiet urgency. For a moment, no one in the operations room spoke. Marcus Vance stared at Ethan like the mechanic had just suggested dismantling the entire facility with a wrench. "That vault is restricted," Marcus said firmly. "Only senior engineering staff have clearance." Ethan looked back at the monitor. "Then one of them should probably start walking." The senior engineer shifted uneasily. "Sir, even if we reach the containment vault, the system requires manual stabilization under pressure conditions." Marcus frowned. "Which means," the engineer swallowed, "it means whoever goes in has to reset the physical regulators while the containment system is still active." Silence followed. Vivienne Arkwright looked toward the massive display wall where the pressure indicators pulsed. "How long?" she asked. The engineer checked the screen again. 10 minutes before we reach breach risk." Marcus turned toward the security team instantly. "Prepare a vault access team," but the engineer shook his head again. "Sir, the vault corridor sealed automatically when containment alarms triggered." Marcus's patience cracked. "Then, override the corridor lock, we can't." Marcus turned sharply. "Why not?" The engineer hesitated. "Because the same authorization loop blocking our system access is also locking the vault corridor." Ethan leaned casually against the edge of the console. "Which means someone planned for that too." Marcus shot him an irritated glance. "You seem very comfortable criticizing systems you don't understand." Ethan shrugged. "Just following the pattern." Vivienne stepped closer. "What pattern?" Ethan pointed toward the pressure display again. "First the ventilation disruption. Then containment locks. Now the authorization loop." The engineer nodded reluctantly. "That's accurate." Marcus crossed his arms. "So?" Ethan looked at him. "So whoever set this up didn't want the problem solved remotely." Vivienne finished the thought quietly. "They wanted someone inside the vault." Ethan nodded once. "Exactly." Marcus shook his head. "That still doesn't explain how we fix it." Ethan tapped the toolbox beside him. "You break the loop manually." The engineer frowned. "That would require physical access to the core regulator." "Right, but the corridor is sealed." Ethan glanced toward the far hallway beyond the operations room. "There's always more than one way into a mechanical system." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "This facility was designed with maximum security." Ethan smiled faintly. "And maximum maintenance access." The engineer suddenly looked uncertain. "Actually, there is a secondary maintenance route." Marcus turned to him. "Where?" "Lower service tunnels beneath Sector 3. Marcus stared. "Why wasn't that mentioned earlier?" The engineer rubbed his neck. "Because it's restricted to infrastructure crews. We rarely use it." Ethan pushed away from the console. "Probably leads to the same regulator chamber." The engineer nodded slowly. "Yes, it does." Marcus exhaled sharply. "Then send a team through the tunnels." The engineer hesitated again. "Sir, the stabilization procedure isn't simple." Marcus looked impatient. "Explain." The engineer pointed at the monitor. Once someone reaches the regulator chamber, they'll have to manually recalibrate the pressure valves in sequence. Ethan nodded slightly. 3 valves. 30-second intervals. The engineer blinked. How did you? Ethan gestured toward the screen. Pressure stabilization always uses triple fail safes. Marcus looked between them. So send the engineering team. The engineer shifted nervously. Sir, if the sequence is done incorrectly, containment pressure could spike. Vivienne stepped forward. And if no one does it? The engineer glanced back at the display. Then the system reaches breach threshold in about 8 minutes. The operations room felt colder suddenly. Marcus looked toward his security officers, prepare protective gear, but Ethan spoke quietly. That won't help, Marcus frowned. What? Ethan looked directly at him. The vault isn't failing because of pressure. Marcus crossed his arms again. Then why is it failing? Ethan tapped the console because someone programmed it to keep failing. The engineer nodded slowly now. The loop will continue restarting the system every time we attempt stabilization. Vivienne looked at Ethan. Meaning? He answered calmly. Whoever goes down there needs to break the loop before resetting the valves. Marcus's voice sharpened. And how exactly do you propose they do that? Ethan picked up his toolbox. Same way you fix most broken systems. Marcus folded his arms. Which is? The mechanic looked at him with quiet patience. You go down there and fix it, Marcus scoffed. Our engineers will handle it, but the senior engineer spoke up again. Sir, with respect, the stabilization process requires someone who understands how sabotage loops interact with containment systems. Marcus looked irritated. And you do? The engineer hesitated. Not exactly. All eyes slowly turned toward Ethan again. He didn't look surprised. He simply opened the toolbox and checked a small set of tools inside. Marcus let out a tired breath. You're not seriously suggesting. Vivienne interrupted him. Can you fix it? Ethan closed the toolbox slowly. Probably, Marcus laughed in disbelief. This is absurd. Vivienne didn't laugh. How certain are you? She asked. Ethan glanced at the screen again where the pressure numbers continued rising. 7 minutes. Then he looked back at her. Certain enough. Marcus shook his head again. Absolutely not. Vivienne turned to him. What's your alternative? Marcus didn't answer, because the monitors behind them suddenly flashed brighter red, and the engineer whispered quietly, 6 minutes. The engineer's voice barely carried across the operations room, but everyone heard it. The pressure monitor continued climbing in slow, merciless increments. Red warning lights reflected across the glass walls while alarms pulsed quietly in the background. Marcus Vance ran a hand across his forehead. This is unacceptable, he muttered. There has to be another way. Ethan stood beside the console, toolbox resting at his feet, watching the numbers like someone reading a familiar map. There isn't, he said calmly. Marcus turned sharply. You don't know that. Ethan gestured toward the screen. Containment pressure, ventilation loop, authorization lock. Whoever built this trap knew exactly how your system responds under stress. Vivienne Arkwright stepped closer. Then they expected someone to come down to the regulator chamber. Exactly. Marcus folded his arms again. And you're volunteering? Ethan gave a small shrug. Someone has to. The security chief shook his head immediately. No. Absolutely not. Vivienne's eyes never left the mechanic. You said you've seen sabotage patterns like this before. Something like it. Marcus looked incredulous. You keep implying experience without proving anything. Ethan crouched beside the toolbox and opened it slowly. Inside were simple tools. Wrenches. A pressure gauge. A small flashlight. Nothing that looked remotely capable of fixing a multi-million-dollar containment system. Marcus scoffed. You think you can stabilize a biotech containment vault with hardware store tools? Ethan picked up the flashlight. Tools don't fix systems. Marcus glared. Then what does? Understanding how they break, the engineer spoke quietly again. 5 minutes, the tension in the room thickened. Vivienne turned toward Marcus. We don't have time. Marcus shook his head stubbornly. Sending an unverified civilian into a containment vault during a system failure is reckless. Ethan stood up and closed the toolbox, then sent someone else. Marcus opened his mouth. But the engineer interrupted again. Sir, none of our engineers have handled sabotage loops inside a containment environment. Marcus looked furious. So you're suggesting this man has? The engineer hesitated. He predicted every system failure before we detected it. Vivienne stepped closer to Ethan. You mentioned earlier that systems like ours are designed to fail safe. They are. And someone turned that design against us. Looks that way. She studied him carefully. How long would it take you to stabilize the regulator? Ethan thought for a moment. If the sabotage loop is where I think it is, 3 minutes. Marcus laughed in disbelief. 3 minutes? Ethan nodded. Maybe 4. Marcus shook his head. You're guessing. Ethan pointed at the screen. You've got 4 minutes left to prove me wrong. Silence. Vivienne turned slowly toward the operations staff. Where is the tunnel entrance? The engineer immediately pointed toward a side corridor. Maintenance-level access 50 meters down that hall. Marcus stepped in front of her. I strongly advise against this. Vivienne's voice stayed calm. What's your alternative? Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward Ethan again. You understand that if anything goes wrong down there, it already has. Marcus clenched his jaw. This facility contains volatile materials. Ethan lifted the toolbox. Which is why we shouldn't waste another minute arguing. Vivienne finally nodded. Show him the tunnel. Marcus exhaled sharply. This is a mistake. Ethan walked toward the hallway without waiting for permission. The engineer hurried ahead to guide him. Marcus followed reluctantly with 2 security officers. Vivienne walked behind them. The corridor they entered looked very different from the polished corporate floors above. Concrete walls, industrial pipes running along the ceiling, emergency lights casting red shadows down the narrow passage. The engineer pointed toward a heavy steel door. Maintenance access. Marcus checked his watch. 3 minutes. Ethan placed the toolbox on the floor and opened it again. The engineer hesitated. You'll need a containment suit. Ethan shook his head. No time. Marcus stared. You're not going down there without protective gear. Ethan picked up the flashlight. Containment pressure isn't high enough yet to require it. The engineer looked uncertain. He's right. But the margin is small. Marcus rubbed his temples. This is insanity. Ethan grabbed the steel door handle. Maybe. Then he glanced back at them. But if you're still watching this story unfold, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell, because what happens in the next few minutes inside that vault is the part nobody in this building will ever forget. Marcus glared. This is not the time for. But Ethan had already pulled the door open. A rush of cold air spilled out from the dark tunnel beyond. The engineer's voice echoed behind him. Pressure threshold in 2 minutes. Ethan stepped into the darkness, flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the tunnel. Marcus looked at Vivienne. If he fails, she answered quietly. Then we all do. Cold air rushed through the maintenance tunnel as the steel door slammed shut behind them. Ethan's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing concrete walls damp with condensation and thick industrial pipes running along the ceiling. The sound of distant alarms echoed faintly through the structure above. Marcus Vance followed close behind with 2 security officers, while the senior engineer hurried to keep up. Vivienne Arkwright walked last, her heels echoing sharply against the metal grating beneath their feet. "How far?" Marcus asked. "About 60 meters," the engineer replied quickly. "The regulator chamber sits directly beneath Lab Sector 3. Ethan moved ahead without slowing. His steps were steady, confident, as if he'd walked corridors like this many times before. Marcus noticed it. "You're not even checking the layout," he said suspiciously. Ethan kept walking. Mechanical tunnels follow simple rules. Marcus frowned. "Which are? Straight lines to important equipment." The tunnel curved slightly downward as they moved deeper beneath the facility. The air grew colder, and the faint hum of machinery began vibrating through the floor. The engineer checked a handheld monitor. Containment pressure still rising. Marcus looked at him sharply. "How long now?" 2 minutes before breach threshold. Vivienne's voice stayed calm despite the urgency. "Move faster." They reached a heavy steel ladder descending into a lower chamber. Ethan stopped and shined the flashlight downward. A narrow platform sat below, surrounded by thick pipes and pressure regulators the size of engine blocks. The containment vault. Marcus looked down the ladder. "Security stays here," he ordered the officers. Ethan had already begun climbing down. The metal ladder rang quietly with each step. When he reached the platform, he crouched beside the large pressure assembly and studied it in silence. Marcus and the engineer climbed down next. Vivienne remained at the top of the ladder, watching everything below. The engineer pointed at the central regulator. "That's the stabilization unit." Ethan nodded slowly. "And the sabotage loop?" Inside the control housing, Ethan tapped the metal casing with his knuckles. "Figures." The engineer looked nervous. "You'll need to open that panel first." Ethan set the toolbox down and began working quickly. Wrench. Flashlight. Pressure gauge. His hands moved with practiced precision. Marcus watched every motion. "You've done this before." Ethan didn't look up. "Something like it." The engineer checked his monitor again. Pressure spike approaching critical. Marcus's voice tightened. "How long?" "About 90 seconds. Ethan loosened the final bolt and removed the metal cover. Inside, a small circuit housing blinked red. "There it is," he muttered. Marcus leaned closer. "What?" Ethan pointed. "The loop trigger." The engineer squinted at the wiring. "Wait, that shouldn't be there," Ethan nodded. "Exactly." Marcus folded his arms. "So fix it." Ethan studied the wiring for a moment. "Not that simple." The engineer swallowed. "Why not?" Ethan pointed to a second cable hidden behind the regulator pipe. "Failsafe trigger." Marcus frowned. "What does that mean?" Ethan finally looked at him. "It means if I cut the wrong wire, the system forces a pressure dump." The engineer's face went pale. "That would spike containment levels instantly." Marcus's voice dropped. "You're telling me one mistake could trigger the breach we're trying to prevent?" Ethan nodded once. "Pretty much," Vivienne called down from above. "How much time?" The engineer looked at his monitor. 60 seconds. The tunnel suddenly felt much smaller. Marcus stared at Ethan. "Can you do it or not?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned closer to the control housing, studying the circuit pattern carefully. Then, he spoke quietly. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing." Marcus snapped. "That's not helpful." Ethan reached into the toolbox and pulled out a small insulated cutter. His voice stayed calm. "They designed the loop to restart every time the regulator tries to stabilize." The engineer nodded. "Yes, that's exactly what we're seeing." Ethan pointed again. "Which means the reset sequence has to happen before the system restarts." Marcus frowned. How long is that window? Ethan glanced at the blinking circuit. About 4 seconds, the engineer whispered, "That's impossible." Ethan ignored him. Instead, he positioned the cutter carefully around one wire. Marcus watched closely. "You get one chance." Ethan gave a faint smile. Usually, how it works, the alarms above them suddenly grew louder. The engineer looked at the monitor again. 30 seconds, Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't screw this up." Ethan didn't respond. His eyes focused completely on the tiny cluster of wires. For a moment, the world shrank to the blinking red light in front of him. The cutter closed slowly around the cable. The engineer counted under his breath. 20 seconds. Marcus clenched his fists. Vivienne leaned forward from the ladder above. Ethan waited. The red light blinked again. And the mechanic whispered quietly to himself. 3 valves, 30-second intervals, 4-second reset window. Then he cut the wire. The wire snapped with a sharp metallic click. For half a second, nothing happened. Then every alarm in the tunnel screamed at once. The regulator chamber exploded with flashing red lights, and the massive pressure pipes shuddered violently as the containment system reacted to the sudden interruption. Marcus instinctively grabbed the railing beside him. "What did you just do?" The engineer's handheld monitor erupted with warning signals. Pressure spike. Ethan didn't even look up. Instead, he moved instantly. "Reset sequence," he muttered. His wrench spun across the first regulator valve. A deep metallic groan echoed through the chamber as the valve rotated open. The engineer stared at the monitor, pressure stabilizing, slightly. Marcus leaned closer. "How many more?" Ethan didn't answer. He was already turning the second valve. The wrench slipped once before catching the heavy steel grip. Another grinding sound shook the chamber. The engineer looked up again. System loop paused. Marcus frowned. "What does that mean?" The engineer swallowed. The sabotage loop stopped restarting the regulator. Ethan's voice cut through the noise. For about 4 seconds, Marcus's eyes widened. "That's it, yep." The mechanic moved quickly to the final valve. The blinking circuit panel began flashing faster again. The sabotage program was trying to restart. The engineer panicked. "It's coming back online." Ethan twisted the third valve with everything he had. For a second, it refused to move. Marcus stepped forward instinctively. "Do you need help?" Ethan gritted his teeth. "No." The wrench turned. A thunderous release of pressure echoed through the pipes. The regulator chamber vibrated as the containment system rebalanced. The engineer stared at his monitor in disbelief. Pressure dropping. Marcus leaned closer to the display. "Stabilization confirmed?" "Almost." The blinking red light inside the control housing suddenly went dark. The sabotage loop collapsed completely. Ethan stepped back slowly from the regulator assembly. The entire vault seemed to exhale. Above them, the alarms abruptly stopped. Silence flooded the tunnel. For a moment, nobody moved. The engineer looked at the monitor again, eyes wide. Containment pressure returning to safe levels. Marcus blinked. "You're sure?" "Yes." The numbers on the display continued falling. The catastrophic threshold line slipped lower and lower until it disappeared entirely. Marcus leaned against the railing, stunned. "You actually did it." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag from the toolbox. System just needed a little encouragement. The engineer shook his head in disbelief. "No, this wasn't just stabilization." He looked at the opened control housing. "You completely broke the sabotage loop." Marcus stared at Ethan. "How?" Ethan shrugged. "Loop relied on the regulator reset signal." Marcus frowned. "And? So, I stopped the signal before resetting the valves." The engineer slowly nodded. That forced the system to bypass the authorization lock. Marcus shook his head. Our engineers never saw that. Ethan gave a faint smile. Different perspective. Vivienne descended the ladder carefully now that the alarms had stopped. When she stepped onto the platform, she looked directly at the regulator assembly. Status? The engineer answered quickly. Containment stabilized, pressure returning to normal parameters. Vivienne looked at Ethan. You were right. He closed the toolbox calmly. System design was solid. Marcus crossed his arms again. Someone still sabotaged it. Ethan nodded. Yeah. The engineer suddenly looked confused again. Wait. Everyone turned toward him. He pointed at the circuit housing. The sabotage code didn't just disable the system. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? The engineer studied the wiring. It rerouted internal diagnostics. Vivienne's expression sharpened. Where? The engineer tapped his monitor again. Someone used the containment alarm to hide a secondary access request. Marcus stiffened. Access to what? The engineer swallowed. A restricted research server's silence filled the chamber again. Ethan leaned against the railing. There it is. Marcus looked at him sharply. You knew this was coming. Ethan shrugged. Containment failures get attention. Vivienne looked toward the engineer. What server? He hesitated. Sector 7 Data Archives. Marcus turned pale. That's impossible. Vivienne's voice dropped. Why? Marcus answered quietly. Sector 7 contains classified research prototypes. Ethan closed the toolbox with a soft metallic click. Then whoever triggered this wasn't trying to destroy your facility. Marcus looked at him slowly. They were trying to steal something. Vivienne's eyes hardened. Can we trace the access? The engineer typed rapidly. Yes, but... Marcus snapped. But what? The engineer looked up nervously. The access point originated inside the facility. Marcus froze. You're saying the sabotage came from someone here. Ethan lifted the toolbox and headed toward the ladder. Usually does. Vivienne looked at him. You're leaving? Ethan paused at the bottom of the ladder. The system's stable now. Marcus crossed his arms. You just walked into a containment vault and fixed a sabotage loop in under 4 minutes. Ethan started climbing the ladder. More like 5. Marcus called up after him. Who exactly are you? Ethan reached the top of the ladder and stepped back into the tunnel light. For the first time since entering the facility, he answered directly. Someone who used to build systems like this. Then he added quietly. Before I learned how easy they are to break. The tunnel doors slammed shut behind them as the group stepped back into the maintenance corridor. For the first time since the crisis began, the alarms above had gone silent. Only the distant hum of machinery remained. Marcus Vance walked beside Ethan, his expression still caught somewhere between suspicion and reluctant respect. You stabilized a containment vault most engineers here wouldn't even approach, Marcus said. Ethan adjusted the grip on his toolbox. System wanted to stabilize. He replied calmly. Just needed the loop broken. They reached the operations level again. The doors opened to a very different room than the one they had left minutes earlier. The flashing red warnings were gone. Engineers crowded around the monitors, watching containment pressure levels return steadily to safe parameters. One of them spoke the moment Vivienne entered. Ma'am, Sector 3 is completely stabilized. Vivienne nodded once. Good. The engineer glanced toward Ethan standing near the doorway. Was that him? Marcus answered quietly. Yeah. The engineer stared in disbelief. Another technician shook his head. We were locked out of that system entirely. Ethan stepped aside to let a group of engineers rush past him toward the lower access corridor. He seemed almost invisible again the moment the emergency passed. Vivienne noticed. Stop. The room froze. Everyone turned toward her. She looked directly at the mechanic. "You don't get to disappear just yet." Ethan sighed slightly. "I wasn't planning on disappearing." Marcus stepped forward. "Actually, we have a few questions." Ethan nodded. "Figured." Vivienne walked toward the main console where the sabotage diagnostics still flickered across the screen. "Engineering confirms what you suspected," she said. "The containment failure was used as a diversion," Marcus added. "Someone accessed Sector 7 archives during the crisis." The room murmured quietly. Sector 7 wasn't a place most employees even knew existed. Vivienne looked back at Ethan. "You said earlier that people who build systems know how to break them. Usually," Marcus folded his arms again. "So tell me something." Ethan waited. "How does a roadside mechanic recognize a military-grade sabotage loop inside a biotech containment system?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "Pattern recognition." Marcus shook his head. "That's not an answer." Vivienne studied him closely. "You also knew the regulator sequence without seeing the system." Ethan didn't respond. "And you knew the maintenance tunnels would lead to the chamber." Still no answer. Marcus leaned forward. "You knew too much." Ethan looked at the floor for a moment. The operations room remained silent. Finally, he spoke. "I used to work on infrastructure systems," Marcus snorted. "That's obvious." Ethan looked up again. "Specifically, containment and redundancy design." The engineer at the console suddenly froze. "Wait." Everyone turned toward him. The engineer stared at Ethan carefully. "Containment infrastructure design?" Ethan gave a small nod. The engineer's eyes widened. "You mean like military containment engineering?" Marcus looked confused. "What is he talking about?" The engineer pulled up another screen quickly. "Ma'am, if that's true." Vivienne stepped closer. "Explain." The engineer typed rapidly. "Military containment systems are designed to resist sabotage loops almost identical to the one we just encountered." Marcus frowned. "And?" The engineer looked back at Ethan. "Those systems were designed by a joint defense engineering group about 8 years ago." Marcus crossed his arms. "So?" The engineer hesitated. "There were only a handful of lead engineers assigned to that project." Vivienne's voice dropped. "How many?" 3. Marcus glanced toward Ethan slowly. "You're kidding," the engineer continued typing. "2 still work for the Department of Defense." Marcus's gaze sharpened. "And the third?" The engineer looked at the screen. Then back at Ethan. "Left the program after a classified infrastructure incident." Silence settled across the operations room. Vivienne's eyes never left the mechanic. "Your name," she said quietly. Ethan called her. The engineer typed again. The database responded instantly. Marcus leaned over his shoulder. "What does it say?" The engineer read slowly. "Former Senior Systems Engineer, U.S. Strategic Infrastructure Division." Marcus blinked. "That's a military program." The engineer nodded. "Yes," he scrolled further. "Specialization, sabotage-resistant containment systems." The entire room went quiet. Marcus stared at Ethan. "You designed systems like ours." Ethan shrugged slightly. "Some of them." Vivienne looked back at the containment display where the pressure levels had fully stabilized. "You knew exactly how to stop the sabotage because you helped design the defenses against it." Ethan gave a faint smile. "Something like that." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "And now you run a small-town garage." Ethan glanced toward the windows where the distant skyline of the town barely appeared beyond the facility walls. "Quieter work." Vivienne stepped closer. "You just saved this entire facility." Ethan shrugged again. "Systems do most of the work." Marcus exhaled slowly. "You realize everyone here assumed you were just a mechanic." Ethan nodded. "Usually works in my favor." Vivienne looked around the room at the engineers who had spent hours trying to solve the crisis. Then she looked back at him. "Today, it saved my company." Ethan picked up his toolbox. Well, he turned toward the exit. Flat tire in the rain seemed like a fair trade. Ethan had almost reached the exit of the operations floor when Vivienne's voice stopped him again. Wait. He paused near the glass doors overlooking the massive research campus. Engineers were already moving again, calmer now, resetting systems and confirming stabilization reports. The crisis had passed. But the weight of what had almost happened still lingered in the air. Ethan turned slowly. Vivienne walked toward him with Marcus and several senior engineers following behind. "You're leaving," she said. Ethan nodded once. "System stable." Marcus crossed his arms again, though the hostility from earlier had faded. "You realize you walked into one of the most complex containment systems in the private sector and solved a sabotage attack faster than our entire engineering division." Ethan gave a small shrug. "They built a solid system." Marcus shook his head. "You built systems like that?" Ethan didn't answer. The mechanic's eyes drifted toward the enormous windows where the facility stretched across the valley, towers of steel and glass glowing under the late morning sun. For a moment, he looked like he was studying it again the same way he had during the storm. Not impressed, just thoughtful. Vivienne noticed. "You could stay," she said quietly. Ethan looked back at her. "Stay? This facility clearly needs someone who understands how these systems actually fail." Marcus nodded reluctantly. "She's not wrong," one of the engineers stepped forward. "Most of our team only works with software diagnostics," he admitted. "What you did down there required experience we don't have." Ethan leaned the toolbox against the floor. "I appreciate the offer." Vivienne watched him closely. "But?" Ethan smiled faintly. "But I have a garage." Marcus sighed. "You're turning down a position that would pay more than that entire building across the street." Ethan chuckled softly. "That building across the street probably doesn't expect me home for dinner." Vivienne tilted her head slightly. "Your daughter?" He nodded. "Leela." For the first time since the morning began, something softer appeared in Vivienne's expression. "You left a major engineering career for your family." Ethan picked up the toolbox again. "Left it because I'd spent too many years building systems designed for worst-case scenarios." Marcus frowned. "That's what engineers do, yeah," Ethan said. "But after a while you start noticing the cost of those scenarios." The room grew quiet again. Vivienne finally extended her hand. "Then allow me to say something at least." Ethan shook it. "Thank you." Marcus cleared his throat. "And if you ever feel like consulting." Ethan smiled. "Maybe." He walked toward the exit again. This time no one stopped him. Security doors opened automatically as he crossed the lobby. Outside, the storm clouds from the night before had completely disappeared. The black SUVs that had brought him here still waited near the entrance. Marcus followed him outside. "You need a ride back to your garage?" Ethan shook his head. "My truck's still there." Marcus gave a small laugh. "Right," he hesitated for a moment. "You know, when we pulled up to that garage this morning, I assumed we were wasting time." Ethan leaned against the railing beside the entrance. "Happens." Marcus nodded. Turns out the most important person in this entire situation was the one fixing cars. Ethan looked toward the distant road leading back to town. "Funny how that works." Vivienne stepped outside behind them. "Your town is lucky to have you." Ethan shrugged again. "They mostly just see a mechanic." Marcus smirked. Probably safer that way, Ethan started walking down the path toward the outer gate. For a moment both Marcus and Vivienne watched him leave. A man in worn boots carrying a toolbox, walking away from a corporate empire he had just saved. Marcus finally spoke. "You think we'll see him again?" Vivienne looked toward the facility towers. If something breaks badly enough, she smiled faintly. I suspect we will. Miles away, Ethan's old pickup truck waited beside Calder Auto Repair. And somewhere inside that quiet town, a 9-year-old girl was probably finishing breakfast and wondering when her dad would be home. Because in the end, that was the real reason he'd walked away from everything else. Now tell me your next story title. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. The janitor they fired fixed the CEO's daughter in the ER, but the truth was even bigger. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?